Warning, this podcast is likely to contain numerous instances of vulgarity and or profanity, which some may deem inappropriate. If you're of an overly sensitive disposition, stop listening now. Additionally, the podcast will be filled with numerous spoilers throughout, so if you haven't had the opportunity to read, watch, or enjoy the story prior to the show, please do so. Before continuing with this episode of Sweet Story, Bro.
Get ready for action! 3, 2, 1, fight!
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the very first debut episode of Sweet Story, Bro, the podcast that analyzes, deconstructs, rips apart, and then stitches back together story. My name is Steve Russell. I'm a writer and director who's currently working on my debut novel, Temporary. I actually chart the entire, process of writing it and what I'm trying to do with it over on my personal blog, writestevewright.com. So if you are interested at all in the book that I'm working on, do check that out. But a question might come up, why podcast? What am I hoping to get out of podcasting? And, why do I think I should have a podcast as well, thrown out into the world like so many other people do? And really, it's because I have a passion that I want to share with you guys. And this ties in directly with my writing and everything like that, and the filmmaking that I do. And that's my love of story. I've had a couple podcasts in the past that have fallen apart, either through lack of commitment or, real life getting in the way, or time management of other people's parts, or whatever it happened to be. But in both of those occasions, the one person that was left out in the lurch wanting more, wishing it didn't have to stop, was me, because I absolutely fucking love the process of podcasting, what it is, and talking with you. And I didn't want that to end. At the same time, though, I didn't think I had anything to offer on a solo experience. That wasn't until I listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore Histories, which I became a very big fan of, and obviously he does it solo. And the thing that struck me about his was the way he presented the story. He presented history in such an engaging way that I've never felt before. I've never been the biggest history buff, and I wasn't a very good student during high school for history, but his podcast kept me captivated, and it's just the way that he processes the information and shares it with us. He tells a story, and it became apparent to me after a little while, I did have to think on it, what could I go into detail with? What do I have to share, a passion I can share with you that I can be engaging about, or try to be engaging about, for a little bit of time with each show? And it was story. Everything that I've ever loved since I was a kid, whether it's pro wrestling, comic books, of course, video games, movies as well, TV shows. The one thing that connects them all, that common denominator, is they're all story-based. They all have to have a story. They all have to have a writer to write them in the first instance. A lot of people forget this, especially when it comes to things like movies. Without the writer, whether it's based on a book or the screenplay writer, there's no movie to watch. That's just a simple fact of it. Same with games. You don't have somebody to write or come up with these ideas, what are you going to play? You're stuck playing Tetris for the rest of your life, or Pong. There's no narrative drive or reason behind it. There's no emotional resonance. And things have changed so much, even since when I was a kid, playing my SNES and then later on PlayStation, to where we're at now. And the thing with the story that's always captivated me is the way it can connect us as a people. We all have opinions on things, and that is what essentially this podcast is for me to share a passion of mine whilst also telling you what I think about it, hence the deconstructing, analyzing, then stitching back together aspect of this show. And ultimately, the show will end with this idea, is a story officially too sweet or just not sweet enough? And I'm just going to go through and explain what I like about a story, what I don't like about a story. I mean, be warned, there will be spoilers galore. There was a little tag at the start of this to warn you of that fact. But yeah, there's no way I can talk about these stories in the depth that I want to dive into them without spoiling everything. So, if you haven't had the opportunity to read, play, watch, or enjoy the story that I'll be talking about on this particular episode or any subsequent particular episodes, go out of the way, man. Pause this, read it, play it, and then come back and listen. And most importantly, once you've done that, let me know what you thought. Not only about my opinion, but also how you felt about the story. You can send me a tweet at sweetstorybro on Twitter or email me at sweetstorybro@icloud.com. I promise you I'm going to read everything I get, and I'll try and respond to the best of my abilities. That's a promise I'm making you right now on the very first episode. And honestly, another contributing factor is this concept of why not me? Why can't I have a podcast? And this derives specifically from my fandom of Kevin Smith and of all his Smodcast network shows. I don't listen to all of them. I pick and choose the ones that resonate with me more, but it's enough for me to get that definite vibe of, hey, if you have something that you love to talk about, in this case, I love to talk about stories, reviewing stories, and just having a discussion about them, then do it. And if you have a passion in the same way for something that you want to talk about, or start a YouTube show, or do a podcast yourself, or start a Twitch channel, or whatever it happens to be, go do it. We live in an age where technology is relatively accessible to so many of us, not all of us, and I appreciate that. But for podcast, man, it's a microphone and a computer. You can get free software, the Audacity, or if you use Mac, use GarageBand. It's right there. I implore you, if you're taking the time out to listen to me, please, if you start one or if you do one yourself, let me know and give me something new to listen to. I'd really appreciate that. So what's the first episode actually going to be about? What's the story that we're deconstructing? And most importantly, will I find out that it's officially too sweet or just not sweet enough? Well, it's interesting that we were actually talking about games earlier and how they've evolved, because the subject of the first episode of Sweet Story Bro is going to be about a video game that was recently released only a few months ago. This is going to be about Until Dawn. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take a moment as well to briefly explain the synopsis of the game as provided by supermassivegames.com, which is actually the developer of the game in the first instance. But I'm also going to be talking about the box art, because box art and cover art for books and all sorts, they all tell a story in and of itself. A lot of the time as a consumer, you'll be browsing the shelves, and one of the very first things that'll take your fancy is going to be that cover art. They never say judge a book by its cover. That extends to a lot of things in life. But like with a lot of things in life, unfortunately, we do. I mean, this could be one of the greatest games of all time, but if it's got really, really bad cover art, I reckon, a lot of people would have looked over it initially. I don't know what you think on that. But the cover art of this, it's a PS4 game that I'm looking at here. It's quite a clever bit of cover art. On the right-hand side, it's predominantly right-hand oriented, is the shape of an hourglass. The top half of the hourglass, however, has been replaced by a human skull. And the bottom half of the hourglass is encased in that glass, giving that sort of form and figure, is a log cabin with snow on top of it with survivors all looking at it. These main characters that we're going to be introduced to soon. There's also some sort of beam kind of emitting from the top of the cabin into the the mouth of the skull. And if you look a little bit deeper, actually, at the skull itself, within the sockets of the eyes are glowing eyes themselves, which turn out to be the supernatural creatures that become a major part of the story as it unfolds for us. And just to the left of this is the logo Until Dawn, kind of fractured, like it's been smashed in ice or something like that. It's a pretty good piece of cover art for the game, although there's a lot of empty space on the left, as this is, again, predominantly about the hourglass with the skull on the right. It's a pretty gripping image, and it does pique your curiosity to want to know perhaps a little bit more about it. The smartest thing about this art, however, is how it takes all the major elements of the story, even those that are yet to be revealed, like that supernatural element, and puts it front and center on the cover. So that everything is right there. It's just you don't really know it just yet. So it's pretty smart in that regard. But what about the story itself, right? So the synopsis, again, this is actually taken from Supermassivegames.com, the UK Guildford-based developers of this game. They wrote the following, and I quote, "When 8 friends are trapped on a remote mountain retreat and things quickly turn sinister, they start to suspect they aren't alone. Gripped by fear and with tensions in the group running high, you'll be forced to make snap decisions that could mean life or death for everyone involved. Every choice you make in your terrifying search for answers, even the seemingly trivial ones, will carve out your own unique story. With spine-tingling performances from a Hollywood cast including Hayden Panettiere of Heroes in Nashville fame, brought to life with the power of PlayStation 4, your actions alone will decide who survives Until Dawn." And there's the major hook of this game and its story, is the fact that the story unfolds and develops based on your decisions. So not everybody, potentially, could make it until dawn. It's aptly titled because obviously that's the entire point of it, is you have to survive until dawn, and you can only survive based on your decisions. It all ties in nicely like that, almost like they thought it through. Now, here's the prologue that I want to read out for you guys. And this prologue is actually taken from untildawn.wikia.com. That's until-dawn.wikia.com. So if you do want to learn a bit more about the game before you play it or whatever, check that out. Or if you have played it and you want to learn a bit more, check it out anyway. It's a pretty good resource. And I quote for the prologue. In 2014, 10 friends, Sam, Josh, and his twin sisters, Hannah and Beth, Mike, Jessica, Emily, Matt, Ashley, and Chris, are gathered together at the Washington Lodge on Blackwood Mountain for their annual winter getaway. During their celebrations, a few of them decide to play a prank on Hannah, who's romantically interested in Mike. While Josh and Chris are passed out, drunk in the kitchen, Mike invites Hannah up to his room. Unbeknownst to her, Jess, Emily, Matt, and Ashley are hiding under the bed and in the closet. As Mike convinces Hannah to start taking off her clothes, the hidden observers reveal themselves just as Sam bursts in to warn Hannah of the cruel prank. Humiliated, Hannah runs out of the cabin and into the snowy woods as some of her friends run after her, trying to apologize and convince her to come back. Hannah's twin, Beth, after learning that Hannah has been humiliated, tells them off and chases after her sister into the woods. As Beth finds her way into the middle of the woods, she locates Hannah crying in the middle of a small clearing and comforts her. Suddenly, they hear a violent noise and run from an unseen pursuer. As they're cornered at the edge of a cliff, Hannah slips and falls, grabbing onto Beth, taking her with her. Beth manages to hang onto a large branch at the edge of the cliff, holding onto her sister with her other arm. The next moment, a man crouches by the edge of the cliff and extends his hand. But Hannah and Beth both fall to their apparent deaths, never to be seen again. Apparently. I add that last part on because I think based on your story and how you figure it out, different things might happen. I know what I got, and the story I'm going to be talking about here is worth just mentioning as a brief aside. The story of Until Dawn that I will be speaking about on this debut episode is going to be my story. It's based on the decisions that I made during a playthrough of the game with my girlfriend Thea, which you can actually watch on YouTube. If you visit youtube.com/Steve Tendo, I've got a couple of caps up on there from a Twitch stream that I did. So you can see my immediate reactions to the game before I was able to process and think about it. And here's the result of that is a podcast for you all as I review the story. So the results of my playthrough may be drastically different to what you end up getting during yours. So, if I'm talking about things that happen in mine that don't happen in yours or are very similar, let me know. I want to know what you got in comparison to what I got. But Until Dawn unfolds, in uniquely specific ways, as we've already discussed, depending on the choices that you make. And that can lead to dramatically different stories developing depending on what you decide during key interactions. And that's really important, is this concept of key interactions, okay? Because certain things within the story are still fixed, I believe. Certain moments have to happen in order to allow the narrative to continue to unfold in a controlled manner. But there are certain multi-stranded story elements that you are in control of, and these are known as butterfly effects or butterfly incidents. And to describe the butterfly effect, I don't know if you've ever seen that movie with Ashton Kutcher, it's basically that, but better. But in case you haven't seen that movie and you want to know a little bit more about it, well, I've hit up Wikipedia on behalf of us, and I'll read out the quote that they have there for you, just a brief explanation on it. And I quote, "In chaos theory, the butterfly effect is the sensitive dependence on initial conditions in which a small change in one state of a deterministic nonlinear system can result in large differences in a later state. The name of the effect, coined by Edward Lorenz, is derived from the metaphorical example of the details of a hurricane being influenced by minor perturbations, such as the flapping of the wings of a distant butterfly several weeks earlier. A very small change in initial conditions had created a significantly different outcome." The idea there, to condense it down in case there was anything there that was a little bit confusing, is, a butterfly can flap its wings halfway around the world and a hurricane happens because of it on the other side. But what if that butterfly didn't flap its wings there? What if it did it 10 minutes before? Would the same thing have happened? It's this concept of a small thing having major ramifications, but somehow being connected despite there not being any sort of obvious thread between the two. Now, as I was saying, I can only really comment on the story that unfolded for me, which again, you can actually watch on YouTube as I play through with my girlfriend Thea, with both of us making decisions together. In theory, we're making decisions together. In actuality, it's a lot of me asking if I should do this or not too sure, and her saying yes and me doing the opposite. So if you want to see two people try to work together but maybe don't really do it to the best of our abilities, watch that, because we do bicker a little bit, unfortunately. Nothing major, thankfully. We're all good. You know, it's just a video game at the end of the day. But yeah, there was a little bit of snipiness back and forth because of the decisions that I asked about, and then I either disregarded what she had to say or I did what she had to say, and something terrible happened, which we'll talk about later on. So do stick around. Now, Supermassive Games, as I said earlier, are actually based in Guildford. They designed this game, and you know, it's interesting because the game that they've designed, despite being UK-based, is so distinctly American. Like, all the tropes that exist within it, and believe me, like, this entire game, pretty much from top to bottom, exists on tropes, this preconceived idea that you know what to expect due to the stereotypes that it uses. Now, this game is actually written by two writers, insofar as what's credited on disc. They go by the names of Graham Resnick, who's actually previously worked on Stakeland, The Innkeepers, and The House of the Devil, to name but a few. I've actually not seen any of those, despite the fact I have heard good things about Stakeland. And the second writer is Larry Fessenden, who's worked on movies The Habit, The Last Winter, and I Saw the Dead. Again, I'm going to hold my hands up right now because I've not actually seen any of those movies. But if you have, let me know, because if they're any good or if they're worth checking out, they could end up being the subject of another Sweet Story Bro down the line, and that could be based off your recommendation. Also, additionally, Larry Fessenden, even though he's not really credited as such, he actually provides the likeness and voice for the flamethrower guy who appears during the prologue. He's the one that's hanging over Beth and Hannah as they hang onto the cliff in this game Until Dawn. And it's interesting that he's not only written this script, but stars in it as well, but doesn't get really attributed as such. You know, he doesn't get credited, shall I say, in that way, which is interesting. Now, between them, they wrote over 1,000 pages of dialogue, situations, you know, things like that, and, you know, conventions within 1,000 pages, man. Like, think on that for a second. 1,000-page script. Most movie scripts are only about 90 to 120 on average, and a book is about 400, 500 pages maybe, depending on what you enjoy to read, of course. So 1,000 pages of different dialogue trees and situations unfolding dictated and dependent on your situation or choices would have been a massive undertaking for anybody. I don't care who you are. You know, like, to commit to that sort of grand scope is a huge, huge creative commitment. And the liabilities of plot holes or inconsistencies or, you know, things like that become just more ramped up because of it. And I think this, actually, thinking on it, is probably one of the major components, major reasons as to why they rely so heavily on stereotype in the first instance, is to get across the concept and the genre that we're dealing with before they then go ahead and rip it apart. And that's one of the best elements of this game, is how it flips everything on its head. But I think I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'm getting a little too excited. Now, I read recently that there was apparently over 10,000 pages of dialogue, and 1,000 pages, which is on the special features of this disc, is actually incorrect, apparently. This is based off a Kotaku.co.uk interview that I saw with them a few months ago. It's worth a read if you're a fan of the game. You know, if you're checking out this podcast because you've already played it and you want to learn more about it, find that interview. It's actually pretty interesting. And, you know, of course, if you haven't played the game, I hope that you're inspired to play this game after the fact to see what kind of decisions that you come up with and what story unfolds for you. But the main narrative, Until Dawn, doesn't cover anything new. It doesn't do anything exceptionally original initially. And I know that I spoke about this just a second ago. I mean, all the tropes are here. It begins as most horror movies do. Scratch that. It begins as most teen horror movies do. You've got predictable, isolated teenagers who are stuck without a means of communication in an out-of-the-way location. You know, whether that's out in the desert or, you know, in the backwaters of America, backwaters in like the Midwest of America or wherever it happens to be. You know, think of movies like Cabin in the Woods or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes. These are all the tropes that we know from the movies because we've seen it all before. And narrative as well. You know, these feature in books. Stereotypes across mediums are very incestuous. They eat each other like that. You know, they exist in all mediums across the spectrum. But it's nothing we haven't seen before, especially if you do watch a lot of horror movies, as I do, because I'm a big horror fan. My mom got me into horror movies ever since I watched Night of the Living Dead and hid behind a pillow to do so growing up. My love of horror is all thanks to her. So thanks, Mom. You know, you introduced me to the macabre in a way that I don't think you ever really intended. But zombie movies, horror movies, ghost stories, vampires, all that stuff, I love it. I love watching it. I love reading it about it. You know, it's such a fascinating medium and how it holds a mirror up to the human condition in a way that I don't think the only comparable genre I think does that better is sci-fi. You know, holding up that mirror to showcase, hey, humanity, guess what? You're not so great. Look what's happened, and it's all because of you. Horror and sci-fi nail that time after time. That's my thought on it. But again, with Until Dawn, these are things we've seen before, because of all the reasons I just stated. But like Joss Whedon's Cabin in the Woods, Until Dawn plays up to its stereotypes. Initially, it might seem like bad writing. Initially, it might just seem like bending and committing to the convention stereotypes to make it easier to understand on a grander level for a broader audience. But that's not what they're actually doing. What they're doing is setting up the stereotype to then change everything. I've actually got a quote from Graham Resnick from one of the special features on the disc that you unlock as you play through the game. And the documentary piece is called 1,000 Pages Behind the Scenes of Until Dawn. And I quote Graham, "These kids are all trying to find themselves. They've been through a trauma, but in general, they're just teenagers trying to figure out who they are. So they're all kind of falling into the patterns, the stereotypes, the characters they see on TV and the movies." End quote. I actually find that to be a really interesting take on it, because what Graham's alluding to here is that because of the situation that they've found themselves in, they're allowing themselves to fall into the stereotypes dictated to them. For example, Mike is a bit of a jock. Well, because the situation where they're being stalked by a psycho killer who's attempting to pick them off one by one, he's a bit of a jock dude. So the stereotype of the jock dude is he wants to fight. He'll be one of the alphas within the group to try and protect everybody. They're allowing themselves to slip into these gender and stereotype cliches because of the situation they find themselves in. I don't know if that's actually what would happen in real life, but it's definitely an interesting sort of take as we explore somewhat regular people, although cliched and stereotyped, experiencing extraordinary circumstances. This gameplay design choice of your decisions affecting the story that you experience isn't anything new, especially within the modern gaming climate. It has a lot in common. I don't know when you were born or what era you grew up in, but it has a lot in common with Choose Your Own Adventure books. I'm most familiar with the ones from the 90s where, you know, you would choose an action for your main character to take, go to the subsequent page to see how the story unfolds. Potentially, like most people, having that finger stuck on the page before, just in case you need to flip back because you went to instant death. Let's not pretend we didn't all cheat. Let's not do that. Okay? I know I did. Put my hands up right now and say I have that finger there. Sometimes you'd use your entire hand to see what alternative paths you could have explored. And that was part of the fun of it, you know? Like, you either led your character to greatness or to death or whatever it happened to be within the context of the story that was unfolding, but it was on your decisions, which as a kid experiencing that was very empowering. Because, of course, as a child, you don't have too much power over major decisions. So to affect a character so directly, it had a profound impact on you, I think. And this is true as well of any of the Telltale game series that are coming out right now, whether it's Game of Thrones or Tales of the Borderland or the superb The Walking Dead. What grounds you within their worlds, what really makes you care and carries that emotional resonance between its characters is the power of choice. Your choice dictates the relationships that develop and unfold, and of course, the story that goes along with that. So the game design and the way that the choices affect what happens, it may not necessarily be like quote-unquote new, but the way that it's presented, especially coupled with the cinematic flair of everything that's on screen, makes it feel very refreshing to experience as a gamer or just as somebody who wants to enjoy a good story. But what about the characters? I've kind of alluded to the fact that they're each stereotypes and cliches in their own way. There are 8 main characters who are all attempted, the Supermassive games attempt to develop them all to some degree so they're not just empty, hollow shells waiting to potentially die. But who are these people, man? Let's find out. Now, I've got character descriptions to each one of the major 8 characters here. Again, these are taken from UntilDawnWiki.com, just like I took the prologue from there as well. The thing is, though, the little definition that I've grabbed from them is actually featured in-game. So what Supermassive games do is rather than allowing situation to develop character, especially in terms of how they talk to one another, how they react to one another, and certain, situations that unfold for them, we're told about their key personality character traits. It's the exact opposite of show, don't tell. And honestly, it's a little bit jarring because of it, because some of the best mediums, some of the best stories are subtle character. They feature subtle character progression in how they react to people, how they talk to their friends, how they react to a certain situation lets you know a lot about that character in the moment. Instead, because this deals so much with stereotype before ramping it, flipping on its head, and then hitting the pedals of the metal to get up to pass 11, Supermassive Games relies on telling us a little tidbit about each and every one of them. I guess it's so that we feel a little bit more of an immediate connection to them. I'm not too sure. When you are any specific character, if you press pause, you'll see all the different relationships that they harbor with other people, and it's all gauged by a scale. So every time you're a different character, you can actually see where they fall within that relationship scale. And this is, of course, impacted by the key decisions that you have between certain characters. So if you do one thing that negatively affects another character, when you're that character, you're going to see that your relationship has suffered because of it, which is pretty cool. It just reminds you that everything is tied in here. So we're going to start with, again, it's difficult to call her the main protagonist because they're all relatively main characters. And of course, we are all main characters in our own lives. We're all the own hero to our own story. Sam. Sam is described in-game as diligent, considerate, and adventurous. She seems to be the most level-headed and friendly member of the group and is rarely the cause of drama. Mike, who's described in-game as intelligent, determined, and persuasive. Mike is known among the survivors for being promiscuous and seems to love women despite his hate for commitment, and is very popular with them. Women, that is. He is a man of action and is usually the first to volunteer and make suggestions. Josh. Josh is described as thoughtful, loving, and complex. Josh's interactions with the other survivors tend to be humorous. He cares for his friends, acts as a brotherly figure to Chris, and likes to make sure everyone has a good time. He shows affection towards Sam. His dreams of following his father's footsteps and becoming a film producer makes him very knowledgeable about special effects and movie props. He constantly uses phrases and words from movies, so he's a big film buff. That's actually a major element to the story, again, that we're told rather than really sort of shown. Unless you go out of your way to investigate every nook and cranny of the game, because when you're going around the log cabin, you can actually pick up like cinema awards and things like that his parents have won in the past, and that helps stitch together a deeper idea of who Josh and his family are. But again, that's kind of predicated on you doing that. I did it because I found it a lot of fun to kind of explore the world that we were inhabiting, but you may not game in the same way that I do. Next up is Chris, who is described as methodical, protective, and humorous. Chris's 3 highest base traits are charitable, funny, and curious. He's very affable and has a witty sense of humor which can be off-putting to his friends. He's analytical, not one to believe in the occult, and is not easily scared. Ashley is described in-game as academic, inquisitive, and forthright. She seems to love books. She does state during it that she does want to be an author, I believe. She dislikes horror movies. Oh, here we go. And dreams of being an author. Yeah, I grabbed that earlier. Emily is described in game as intelligent, resourceful, and convincing. I was going to say conniving, but no, it says convincing. She has a quick tongue and sharp wit and is known in the group for her withering put-downs. She mentions that she has a 4.0 GPA during an argument with Jessica. And that's something she kind of comes back to time and again because she thinks she's a lot smarter than she actually fucking is. Matt is described in game as motivated, ambitious, and athletic. He's the second youngest in the group and is fiercely loyal to Emily, though their relationship can be quite one-sided at times. He's not the sharpest tool in the shed, but has a huge heart and knows when to stay out of the way of situations. And finally, Jessica. Jessica is described in the game as confident, trusting, and irreverent. Jessica is a typical provocative young woman who's quite brash in personality and dreams of being a model. So, I mean, those are the main characters that we have to deal with during the course of our time with Until Dawn. And again, they all fall into this stereotype, each one of them, you know, whether it's sort of a cheerleader or the token bitch or the jock or the comedian, the geek, they all have a role to fill and they all perform wonderfully because of it, because they all exist as that cliche. I mean, even protagonist Sam, you know, she, I think, is the closest thing that they were attempting to have with something that bucks the trend, I think. Because, honestly, Supermassive Games, they come across as quite a knowledgeable and intelligent development company. I'm sure that they're aware of this. And, hey, they probably even did it on purpose. In fact, you know what? They did do it on purpose. Sam falls into that 1992 final girl theory. And if you've never heard of the final girl theory, that's fine. I'm about to explain it to you now. I first came across it as I was studying film studies back in sixth form. It's actually a term coined by Carol J. Clover in her book, which is entitled Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, wherein a seemingly weak female main character manages to find the grit and determination needed in order to survive, usually being the lone survivor by the story's end. So somehow, through it all, this seemingly weak little girl is the only one to survive. She's actually got the pluck, the pluck and courage to do what everybody else couldn't do throughout the movie, and that's make it through to the end. That's what the final girl theory is. And it's one that pervades a lot of cinema. You see it in movies like Halloween or Alien. It's cross-genre, this theory. Honestly, I think this is just another example of Supermassive Games playing with the genre conventions and stereotypes before flipping that switch again. The main bulk of the narrative, though, it all takes place a year after the events that occurred to Hannah and Beth. Joshua's decided to bring everybody back together for a party to commemorate the disappearance of his sisters, should I say. And I mean, it's a little bit of a weird one because I would have thought the last thing that you would have wanted to do was return to the place where your sister's bodies have never been found. But to each his own, I guess. He wanted to bring everyone there, and he thought it was a respectful thing to do to party in the same place where they played a prank on one of his sisters before she ran out and died, we think. Again, the bodies have never been discovered. Don't forget that, man. Like, the bodies are still out there, supposedly. A lot of what happens in the first initial chapters are very, very quick character development. It's fast character and relationship development between all of the main protagonists. In my opinion, I think this happens maybe a bit too quickly. We've got 8 main characters, a bunch of interconnected relationships, as well as previous histories that exist between certain characters, all thrown at us very, very quickly. As an example, within the first few chapters, Matt is yelled at by Emily before she demands that he goes back to go get her luggage because she forgot it. Mike has a flirtatious snowball fight with Jessica, which lasts quite long. Chris and Ashley crush hard on one another, on each other. These are two people that like one another but can't pull the trigger to just tell each other as such. And as well, past history is hinted at between Mike and Emily, with Matt having to witness it all. So Matt is the new boyfriend to Emily, and Emily and Mike have done stuff in the past, whether that was more of a relationship-based stuff or purely physical, we're not told, but Matt certainly seems to think one way or the other on it. He's got an idea of what could have happened, and he's for all of his nice qualities, he does get a little bit jealous because of it. Especially within this context of all of them being together in a boiling pot of hormones that is the the lodge. They have nowhere to go. One of the smartest things that Until Dawn does in terms of how it structures itself is by adhering to this sort of chapter hierarchy and architecture. It paces itself with the use of these chapters like a well-structured TV show, each one feeling more like an episode of something. So you can sort of dip in and dip out if you wanted to, but it's much more enjoyable to experience the narrative almost as a whole. If you've got the time to sit down and just blast through it, I definitely recommend doing that. This is complete with previously on Until Dawn stingers, much in the way as you would have used to have gotten previously on Lost. And then there's a brief recap of everything that happened just to remind you. So if you do need to play a couple and then jump away, or you're too scared and you need to go to sleep, assuming you can sleep, by the time you play again the next day when it's bright, so you don't have to be scared and the curtain's wide open, you don't have to try and struggle to remember where you were. It gives you a nice little cinematic recap of what had happened. Now, I honestly think that the story falls folly a little bit in the early stages due to its own attempts at sort of meta relevance. We're a horror game, we're fully aware we're a horror game, so we're going to play with those horror conventions. Same way as Tucker and Dale versus Evil do, same way that Cabin in the Woods does, as we mentioned earlier. What ultimately happens is the main bulk of the early story is just too obvious. Any idiot who does film studies or media studies for a couple of weeks and then pretends to know everything about anything to do with genre, narrative, or filmmaking will take great pride in trying to point out how obvious a lot of the situation scenarios and dialogue exchanges are between these characters. Now, I hate to admit it, but in this particular case, those guys on their high horses are actually correct. But there's a big difference between being in a passive cinema audience, telling people, don't go in that room, man, there's a murder in there, you're going to get killed. And then, of course, the character goes into the room in order to carry on the story, actions unfold, so on and so forth. In a game, it's totally different, because if you allow yourself to be crippled by fear to the point that you don't go through that door, or alternatively, you think you're so smart so you're not going to go through that door, guess what? You're going to be stuck. You've just pulled the handbrake on the narrative, and nothing else is going to happen for you. Your character may be safe, but you're not going to enjoy the rest of the game. That's the big difference between being an audience member to a game and an audience member to a movie. It's one of the reasons that stopped me playing the Resident Evil series for so long, is because I was such a fucking pussy when it came to it. I was way too scared to get nitty gritty with those games, because there's a major difference within my mind to, oh, that guy's going to walk through the door and then there might be a zombie in there and he's going to blow him up. Cool, that's exactly what happened. 2, I'm going to go through this door. There's a loading sequence of the door opening. I don't know what's in there. It may be a zombie, and if it does, it's going to attack me. How many bullets do I have? Only 3. Awesome. Am I going to survive? Big, big difference between those two same situations. Larry Fessenden actually writes, it was actually interviewed by Kotaku.co.uk, and he talks about this to a degree, and I quote, "It brings responsibility back to the player," said Fessenden. "You're no longer laughing at the choices the characters make. You're actually making them. It almost subverts the subversion by making you responsible for the choices. You can't just laugh at them in a safe space." End quote. And he's 100% right on that. You can't look at these guys and their decisions and laugh at them for going, oh, what a stupid decision. I can't believe he did that. What an idiot. Because you're the fucking idiot making that decision. And then past that, you're the one who has to walk through the goddamn door. It's that much more interactive because of it. It's that much more immersive because of it. And honestly, if this story existed simply as a movie or a TV show, it would not be as well received as it is as a game. And Until Dawn, this is its greatest strength, is the fact that it is a game. This total medium, it benefits the story that they're trying to tell, especially where they're playing with stereotypes and then flipping it on its head. It's the only reason that this has gone on to become the game of the month for both Push and GameSpot. It's won 2 awards as of this date, and probably a lot more, but those are the 2 major ones I've been able to pull. Here's an interview taken with Fessenden again, actually with the mirror.co.uk, talking about story and progression and how they did it for Until Dawn. And I quote, "When you write a linear story, you make decisions around the character, but on this we had to imagine what if the characters made a different decision, allowing the gamer to go in and make those choices," said Larry Fessenden, who, along with his co-writer Graham Resnick, scripted the game. Larry continues, I'm brought to it an enthusiasm, like a choose your own path. You want to draw the audience in and replicate the horror of existential reality. End quote. And that, again, that totally ties into what I was talking about earlier, with the whole choose your adventure books, the telltale game style things where emotional impact is generated from the resonance you feel because of the power that you have as a gamer to change the story. I mean, what happens here, teens are stalked by a psycho killer within the Canadian wilderness of Blackwood. Blackwood Mountains, which is where the ski lodges resides. So you've got a psycho killer. You dictate what they kind of look like. Mine ended up having a clown mask on and things like that. I think the other option was to be like a scarecrow. And this as a concept is one we've seen before, teens being stalked and potentially picked off one at a time. But this story takes a nice break as they break off into their own cliques. They don't keep them all together, the 8 of them, throughout the entire period of the story. And it's when they separate them that the story gets a lot more interesting. For example, Mike and Jessica are the lovers looking for a romantic sex cabin. That's what they're doing. They're looking for a place to be alone so they can have as much sex as possible during the time that they're up there in the woods. It may be cold, but I think that the 2 naked body heats together will keep them warm. That's their intention, at least. Their journey takes an unexpected twist, though, as it forces them deep into some abandoned Canadian mines before coming out the other end, followed by the first hints of the supernatural enemy that will become a major component of the third act. Matt and Emily, they're the new couple with previous hang-ups because Emily and Mike used to be a thing. Matt is a likable character. He's ready and willing to help, even if it means getting walked all over, which is exactly what the highly strung token bitch Emily does. Chris and Ashley are next. They're the fledgling couple, as I spoke about earlier. They're crushing hard on each other, but they're not willing to pull the trigger. Not willing, but maybe not able. They're both kind of shy in that regard. They like each other, but haven't been able to admit it just yet. And the question for them when they break off in their pair is, could this trip away together be exactly what they need to ignite a romance, even in the face of this supernatural threat? And this is where it gets interesting now, because we've got 2 characters, Josh and Sam. Josh, of course, is the brother to the sisters Hannah and Beth from last year's prank. He's brought them together again in order to honor the memory of his sisters. And then you have Sam, the final girl. Now, Sam doesn't really have too much of a romantic interest in this game, just like Josh doesn't have too much of a romantic interest of his own, despite Supermassive Games' attempts to seemingly partner them up together. They're the only 2 out of the 8 that don't have a defined partner, and so I guess it makes narrative sense to try and bring them together. This isn't really explored properly, and at least in my playthrough, it's quickly forgotten about when survival instincts start to kick in against psycho killers. As somebody has infiltrated the cabin, is attempting to kill them one by one. I don't think that potential crushes really take precedence over surviving through the fucking night. Until dawn, if you will. Hey, do you remember when I mentioned that Josh's parents were film producers and bigwig movie moguls? Well, guess what? That comes back big time now, because it turns out that Josh is the psycho stalker. What's happened is he's been using all the skills that he's picked up and accrued over his entire childhood, his entire life, when it comes to special effects and things like that, in order to trick everybody that he's a psycho killer trying to kill them. It was all a big elaborate prank made possible due to the money that his rich family obviously have and his knowledge of Hollywood special effects. Now, his twisted reality is furthered by the conversations that he has with this is he real or is he fake psychologist called Dr. Hill. And these little sequences, before we know it's Josh, we just get the back of his head. Once we know it's Josh, we see his face during the sequences. But they're actually very clever bumper narrative that happen in between the endings and beginnings of each Until Dawn chapter. And the decisions that we make as Josh without knowing that it's Josh dictate what the psycho looks like, the things that might happen, like do you like fire, do you like nails, or whatever it happens to be. And these elements that you choose get placed into the story because you are Josh at that point, even though you don't know it. It's a clever way, again, to ingratiate, or sorry, that's the wrong word, to integrate your choices on a deeper level, because now not only are you choosing how to survive, but you're choosing how to kill your own survivors who are trying to survive based on your choices. It's a very rounded way to do it. It's quite nice. Now, the supernatural elements actually begins to get ramped up parallel to this their psycho interactions. It's very, very clever, because at first you think that everything that's happening is simply because of the psycho, but once it's revealed to be Josh, it quickly turns out that maybe something more sinister is afoot than they initially expected or thought. Because once it's revealed that Josh is actually the killer, and everything that's been happening has been preset in order to trick everybody, including this, it actually extends to his own fake death, where Chris has to make a really tough decision between who survives, Ashley, his crush, or his friend Josh, who could potentially do more to help him, and then in my choice, we end up killing Josh, even though it was a little bit, I think that was the mistake. You can have a look on the YouTube, the way me and Thea react to that, because I think I intended to kill Ashley at first, but ended up killing Josh anyway. But again, this might just actually be one of the pre-scripted moments that have to happen, because with Josh dead, then we now have the ability to have that key dramatic reveal. Haha, I'm not dead. On top of which, motherfuckers, I'm the dude that's been killing you all along, or at least pretending to. All the ghosts, the supernatural elements with the ghosts, all fake, all Hollywood trickery. Which is, it takes away a little bit from it, because as you're experiencing it, you're like, okay, cool. So there's a psycho, then we've got this supernatural element with monsters, but we also have this ghost element. What's that all about? These spectral elements, could it be the sisters? And then it kind of turns out it's not that at all. It's just a clever, elaborate plan by Josh. But one of my favorite elements of this, and this ties into that supernatural side of things, is the way that Supermassive Games have actually tied in native Canadian mythology. And they've done this primarily through totem pole elements that you can find through the game that show you potential endings. They show you potential cutscenes that could happen determined by your choices. It's just a snippet. For example, so-and-so may die, and this is how they die. So you're kind of aware of the context. Okay, so for example, Emily gets shot in the head, and she's surrounded by a couple of people. How do we get to that point? More importantly, what can we do to make sure that doesn't happen? The use of these totem poles are very, very good. Not only to introduce these story elements of what could potentially happen, teasing potential deaths or survivors, but it's also just nice in the way that they've integrated that mythology aspect. This concept of change, the butterfly effect, as well, is really hammered home within these totemistic idols, which also cover this really nice concept, narratively, of the other, this idea of the other existing within each person, which also, that coincidentally ties into the concept of the supernatural beings we're about to encounter. So it turns out that during the 1950s, a number of miners were trapped underground in the mines that surround the mountainous region of Blackwood. And these are actually the mines that we explored earlier with Mike and Jessica. Now, these miners were eventually found, and it was quickly established that something had changed within them. And this was established by a test conducted at the nearby abandoned sanitarium, which is very close to the Blackwood ski lodge where all the guys are staying. They had encountered something in the mines, or had something done to them that made them turn. They evolved, they changed into something less human. The miners turned into something monstrous. Okay? And what it turns out is that the miners have been infected with a curse. Now, the curse is one that's actually, this doesn't come out of the blue. As long as you're kind of going around the game world and picking up all these loose pieces of paper to read and reading reports whilst you're exploring the sanitarium and things like that, the story starts to develop and unravel itself for you as it goes. But again, this is kind of only if you go out of your way in order to enjoy those elements. If you just plow through it and don't bother to look around the world, you're going to miss a lot because of this. But this curse is one that, if they were to feast on the flesh of another human being after having been bitten by this monster, then they in turn turn into this monster. and this monster is known as a Wendigo. Taken from Wikipedia, I'm about to give you a description of what a Wendigo is, and I quote, "A Wendigo is a half-beast creature appearing in the legends of Algonquian peoples along the Atlantic coast and Great Lakes region of both the United States and Canada. The creature or spirit could either possess characteristics of a human or a monster that had physically transformed from a person. It is particularly associated with cannibalism. The Algonquian believed those who indulged in eating human flesh were at a particular risk. The legend appears to have reinforced the taboo against the practice of cannibalism. It is often described in Algonquian mythology as a balance of nature." End quote. And again, this is where it's really nicely explored with the use of Native Canadian mythology tied in directly with this sense of other as represented by the totem poles and the fractured potential paths that any one person has to go down. Now, it turns out that the flamethrower guy that we've mentioned earlier, the one that looked like he was threatening Beth and Hannah at the very beginning and has a run-in with Emily as well during the mines when she's down there, it turns out he's a Wendigo hunter. And what he does is he contains his prey rather than killing them. Because, apparently, killing them simply releases the spirit of the Wendigo to then subsequently inhabit some other form, and then it carries on, transforming, mutating other people. So it's a never-ending curse, if you will. The only way to stop it is to contain everybody that is being infected. And that's what he's doing, actually, at the sanatorium. When you first explore the abandoned ruins, initially as Mike, I believe, it just looks like a crazy, deserted place where he's living. And we're still not sure whether he's a good guy or a bad guy at this point. In fact, it's painted very clearly that we're meant to believe he is a bad guy out there with evil intentions for us. We get a scene where he and the rest of the survivors are still in the cabin. And it's at this point that he turns out to be a bit of a donor character because he departs some very, very precious information to us. He's the one who tells us all about the Wendigos out there in the woods. He's the one telling us about the mythology behind them and the fact that it's safer to contain them than it is to kill them. This is something he's actually dedicated his life to, killing them and keeping them locked up in the abandoned Blackwood Sanitarium. And herein lies one of Until Dawn's weakest story elements, actually. The flamethrower guy up until this point is a supposedly dangerous antagonist, right? It's actually revealed that he's a bit of a badass savior, And then he dies. Just like that. In an attempt to rescue Josh from a Wendigo attack, and this is after the revelation that Josh is the psycho who's been hunting us and tricking us all, he, that is the flamethrower guy, is then gutted in front of Chris, just flat killed. Now, why does Josh need rescuing? Well, after it's revealed that it's him as the psycho killer, the others take chagrin of this. Naturally, they do, as you would as well, I would imagine. And so they take him outside and they tie him up to decide what to do with him. He's almost shot by Mike, who's stopped by Chris. And we go back out in order to rescue him once we realize that there are Wendigos on the prowl who could kill him at any second. So in the process of trying to rescue the guy who's been fucking with us the entire time, this new character, this new almost Obi-Wan-esque character, just gets flat killed in no time at all. And it's really frustrating, actually, because he could have been an absolute badass. But instead, it just falls completely flat. The lack of development that his character receives is very different to the rest of this game because of how short a period of time we have with him. He's dropped into the group as an important donor character. He departs the advice and then he ends up getting killed off so easily. He doesn't make the sort of impact I think the writers were looking for, in turn becoming a bit of a wonder. Instead of getting an oh my god moment, you're instead left feeling empty and detached towards his death. At least that's how I took it. I'd love to know how you felt regarding Flamethrower Guy's death. And this sort of ties in a little bit, because even with the potential deaths of some of the main characters, because they're all such stereotypes, there's maybe a level of disassociation to it. Stereotypes without further development don't breed caring within an audience member. It doesn't matter if your choices lead to their death or survival if you really ultimately don't care about the character, right? honestly, the only characters I actually found likable were Matt, Chris, Sam, and in actually a surprising twist, I actually ended up really liking Mike. I think Mike as well as Josh are the only two to really, really get major character development throughout the game. All the other characters kind of come into the story one way, survive, and end the story kind of in the same, but obviously traumatized to a degree. Mike goes through major character development because he comes in as a bit of a douchebag prick joker, making fun of other people to make himself feel big, bullying people slightly. He is a jock, after all. Sorry to rock that stereotype. If you're a jock listening to this and you find that offensive, I do apologize. But again, this game exists off of stereotypes, and the idea of the pea-headed jock is definitely one that exists in this world, and it's one that Mike subscribes to initially. But after he separates with Jessica and Jessica dies in the down, she's one of the first to get eaten by the Wendigos. Again, when it's first teased, Mike is unable to save her. He didn't get to her in time. That changes him. He goes into the sanitarium, tracks down the guy and the flamethrower guy, and he starts to, and I hate this term, but he starts to man up a little bit. His character starts to subtly change and shift into one that's willing to take accountability to try and make something happen. He stops being just a braggadocious douchebag, and he starts to inhabit true hero qualities, selfless hero qualities, where somebody he cares about is just being killed, and he wants to get revenge, for lack of a better word. He wants to get justice for that, even in the face of a supernatural terror that he's not fully aware of yet. That's pretty cool. Matt comes across as a very likable character simply because of how nice he is. He's actually probably one of my favorites in there. And as I said, apart from Mike, Josh is the only one that has major character development. And that's because of his descent into madness. And it's all because of his descent into madness. Take that away, and he's just a bit of a weird creepo who invites everybody back to the house a year after his sisters disappear. And there's not much else to him, despite the fact he's played with a wonderful believability by the guy who's in Mr. Robot. His name escapes me right now. I do apologize. I probably got a few of you yelling his name at your speakers as I continue to talk. But it's his descent into madness that really fleshes him out and rounds him out, because you really see the cracks start to form at the edging of his personality, where he's trying to hold it together, but it's obvious that he's lost it. Even when he's revealing that everything was a prank, he still can't understand why they're upset, because it was all just a joke. But at the root core of his joke is an attribution of blame. He blames his friends for what happens. He just doesn't know how to vocalize it, I guess. And so he does it in a very aggressive way. Nothing passive about it, I suppose. It's the same way where you might make a joke and go, "Oh, I'm just kidding." But there could be a little bit of truth underneath that, underlying it, One of the best scenes in this story actually comes during his descent into madness, just before we all start coming to the final portions of the story. It's kind of just as the third act begins near the end of the second act, where he falls literally and figuratively into a hole, and he's then confronted by his demons. He's actually forced to confront his emotional and psychotic demons in a series of graphic conversations with his sister's decomposing bodies. Think about that for just a second, okay? In your mind, you're having a conversation with two people that you love very much who've been missing for a year as they decompose in front of you. It's pretty messed up. Honestly, it is detailed, it's uncomfortable, it's insightful insofar as Josh's fractured psyche goes, and it's actually pretty wonderfully written. I do recommend experiencing it yourself firsthand if you can. If not, again, my playthrough's online. You can always watch that when you have the time if you wanted to. And what's nice about this scene is the way that Josh falls deeper and deeper into this psychotic state, to a point where he doesn't know what is or isn't real anymore. And you go through the rest of that little chapter until he dies at the hands of his sister as he and Mike walk through a body of water, because Mike at this point is still trying to save that dude. He's trying to help him because he's his friend, despite everything that he's done. But Hannah gets to him first, and we recognize the fact that this twisted Wendigo monster is Hannah due to the butterfly tattoo that she has on her arm. And the butterfly tattoo, again, butterfly effect, really hammered home throughout the course of the game. But if you find family photos of them in their house and things like that, Hannah's tattoo is always prevalent, really hammering it home so that this is the pathos, this is the payoff, where you see that and you go, holy fucking shit, that is Hannah, that is his sister, and she is about to kill him. Now, how did Hannah become a Wendigo? It becomes apparent during the time down there that Hannah ate Beth. Beth's body, I believe it was beheaded, is found, and you can see that she's been bit. So at a certain point, the need to eat consumed Hannah. No, the irony there is rich, but it took her over to a point where she couldn't contain herself anymore, attacked her sister, feasted on her flesh, and then turned into this horrible monster that ends up eating her brother as well. You got to feel kind of sorry for this family because nothing works out for them. 2 sisters go missing. The brother is grieving. The parents are nowhere to be seen, obviously. We don't know what's really going on with them. They're probably on a cruise somewhere with all their movie money. But we find out that, man, like, one sister's being eaten, the other turns into this cannibalistic monster and then eats her fucking brother. It's pretty fucking twisted. And insofar as my playthrough went, the story left Hannah still existing underneath the mines, ready to eat or attack any traveler that happens to cross her path. And I mean, after that, it kind of, like I said, it all comes to a head as we careen towards the finale of this story. The Wendigos are out. We've had some exciting times with them, escaping them from the sanatorium, things like that. We discover what happened to the sisters. Josh gets his comeuppance. The rest of the remaining Wendigos who escaped from the sanatorium now are actually closing in on the remaining survivors who have all collectively come together at the cabin as the place that makes the most sense. And as a meeting point, I suppose. And what happens within the cabin quickly affects the ending. And I mean, in a flick of a switch. And it's somewhat fitting to use that as a comparison point because as Sam, we have the ability to flick a switch within the cabin. And my only recommendation to you, if you've not played it yet, is don't flip that switch. Do not listen to your girlfriend as she tells you to flip that switch, man. I'm telling you, because that's what I did. And no offense to you, Thea, I love you to bits, but we got a lot of people killed because of that. Not everybody made it out because of that exact choice. And it led to, honestly, a very flat ending. It was a really, really sudden, flat ending. As the house explodes, a couple of the main characters get blown up with it. Sam jumps outside, as well as I think 1 or 2 survivors that was smart enough to get out of the way before flipping the fucking switch. And then it ends. Some of the Wendigo spirits come flying out towards the camera in a faux 3D sort of way. Like early 3D movies where somebody would point towards the screen and you'd have a finger in your face. It flies out in that same sort of way. It's morning now. Morning is broken. We have survived until dawn. At least some of us have. And then a helicopter comes over the crest of the hill talking about survivors. And that's it. After all the build-up, the ghost scares, the Wendigo supernatural twist, the interesting inclusion of Native Canadian customs and themes and stuff, as well as, the truly comprehensive plots of revenge and of course, horny teen angst and lust that exists between them, because a lot of these guys just want to go away and have the sex cabin, as they talked about earlier. It just ends. Yeah, the cabin blows up, but apart from that, it just ends with the helicopter coming across and going, we have some survivors. It doesn't feel like a true resolution. Even if we are then immediately treated to a sequence where the survivors recount their experiences to a camera, kind of being interviewed in a police station whilst the experience is still fresh in their minds, whilst the credits are rolling, that's just not enough. I will say that as epilogues go, it's a pretty weak final note, although it is one that manages to have an appropriate sort of somber tone, as we are reminded of those that we as a gamer failed to save, because the only people to be able to give their statements are the ones who survived until dawn. Everybody else is not present, and we're just talking about them in a past tense, because obviously they would have been dead at that point. So, I mean, in that respects, the epilogue use of the tapes is kind of cool. But again, that flat sudden end is such a problem for what is otherwise a really well-rounded and well-paced narrative. Honestly, it's a shame that the first act, if not first half of this game, of the story, relies so heavily on trope and stereotype, because when it switches it up, the smartest thing that this story does is flips everything on its head, as I talked about at the start. And how does it do it? It makes the supernatural element the main story arc. What at first was this stereotypical survival horror game of teens with a psycho stalker tracking them down, as soon as we have that revelation that one of the psycho stalker story was Josh and it was all an elaborate hoax, well, what happens then? The main narrative is kind of done. But we had the supernatural element running parallel with it, and then that becomes the main story. Flipping it on its head like that, overtaking it, and then becoming the main narrative thread is the best thing that this story has going for it. And this is why I was hammering this home earlier, the same way that Joss Whedon does with Cabin in the Woods, is all stereotype until it's not. And it's something that Supermassive Games actually does really, really well, in my opinion. It becomes so interesting and engaging as soon as that supernatural switch occurs, turning that secondary backstory into the main focus. And like I said, it's by far the smartest thing that it pulls off. Characters are likable, but they don't really provide anything particularly memorable outside of the most obvious stereotypical traits, which is an issue as they never grow out of that stereotype. But coupled with this story, the way it unfolds, the way it does, it helps. It really brings it all together. For all its flaws, and especially that flat ending, this twist of what we thought was the story evolving and propelling into something totally different becomes captivating as an audience member. As somebody who's taking in this story, I suddenly want to know more. I want to stay in this world because what I thought I knew isn't what I know at all. There are a lot of elements that work really well within Until Dawn's story. The strong dialogue and usage of that Native Canadian mythology is actually really well researched and implemented into the story. So it's not just tacked on; it's actually an inherent part of everything that happens. The Wendigo mythology ties directly into this Native Canadian history and what they believed, especially when it came to cannibalism and what it can do to a human, changing them. And couple this with Supermassive cinematic focus, which allows it not only a beautiful cinematic feel, but the narrative is given a focused clarity because of it, with this cinematic TV episodic nature where it's broken down into chapters. It's akin, it feels like it's like The Sopranos, it's like Lost or whatever your favorite TV show happens to be because of it, It's given structure. Yeah, there are weaker episodes within any given season, just like there may be weaker chapters within the entire playthrough of this. But take that step backwards, look at the entire season rather than picking apart story by story, and you can go, you know what, that season was actually pretty good. As opposed to, man, so many episodes of that sucked, that's a bad season. You got to take that objective step backwards. But honestly, the inconsistent story quality, as I just kind of touched on, some chapters were worse than others, along with that sudden disjointed ending, which I find very hard to forgive because of how sudden it was. It leaves you kind of yearning for a more resolute and rounded conclusion. And even though you're surviving until dawn and day is breaking and everything comes to a head at that point, night is going on, you've got this timer as chapters go on so you know when during the night you are, and you're heading towards the morning. Despite that, it still doesn't feel like it comes to a great conclusion. So the question becomes, as I'm sure you're wondering, do these elements, these minor failures, tarnish the rest of the story, the entire experience of what the story of Until Dawn is? I'm happy to say no, it doesn't, actually. For me, some of its flaws end up actually highlighting the elements that it does really, really well. And I'm really happy to say with this debut episode of Sweet Story Bro that this story of Until Dawn is officially too sweet. So that'll bring us to the end of the very first episode of Sweet Story Bro. Hey, thank you so much for checking it out and downloading it and then giving it a listen, giving it a try. And like I said, man, at the top, if you had a different story unravel for you for Until Dawn, or if you have comments on my playthrough or what I chose to do or didn't do, let me know. You can contact me on Twitter at SweetStoryBro or via email at sweetstorybro@icloud.com. And most importantly, honestly, if there are things that you enjoyed or things that you think I can improve upon, let me know, because that's the only way this podcast is going to improve and grow. And what I really love is to have this kind of cultivate the sense of community when it comes to here, where we can all start discussing story, because this opinion, this is mine, but the story is all of ours now because it exists out there. You can go and buy it and appreciate it and experience it yourself, and then share your experiences too. So I can't stress this enough. I actually really want to know what you think about the story. And then if other people have differing opinions, I'll give their shout outs too. And then, we've got a diatribe going on. That's one thing I really would love to come out of this podcast. So don't be shy in getting in contact with me and letting me know what I'm doing right and letting me know what you think I could be doing better. I'd actually really appreciate the feedback. And of course, if there's a story that you would love for me to cover or experience, recommend it to me. If it's something that takes my fancy, I'll give it a read, I'll give it a play, I'll give it a watch, and maybe I'll review it on the show. Who knows? But the only way we can find out is by you getting in contact, man. Honestly, I might just find my next favorite story because of you. Or alternatively, I might just introduce you to your next favorite story via one of these podcasts. I'm actually intending to release these podcasts on a bi-weekly basis so that we have the opportunity to release a new episode, and then the week after, I'm going to be releasing details on what I'm covering for the next episode. So you'll never be left behind if you don't want to be. You can actually take that week to read or watch or listen to or whatever it happens to be that subsequent story, so that when it comes to listening to that new episode, you will be able to understand all the elements that I'm talking about, giving us this opportunity to further cultivate this community. Essentially, it's going to be like a story club, essentially, but I don't know, maybe name something less dorky. I don't know if you can come up with something better. And if you can, just let me know. Just send me a tweet or an email, And that's going to do it for this debut episode. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this debut episode of Sweet Story Bro. I really appreciate it. Be sure to subscribe via iTunes and Soundcloud so you never miss a future episode. So until next time, I'm Steve Russell, imploring you to go enjoy some stories. I'm out.